In 1990, a geologist from Boston University, named Robert Schoch, visited Egypt to study the Sphinx, the largest ancient statue in the world. The objective was to study it from a geological perspective. At first, he believed that the classical theory correct in its assumption that the Sphinx was carved around 2500 BC by King Khafre. Nevertheless, many question marks around the Sphinx remained unanswered. Why no inscriptions have been found on its body indicating his age or who carved it? Why is its body eroded? And why is the head's size inconsistent with the body's size? Despite the capability of the ancient Egyptian sculptors, by the end of his investigation, Robert Schoch concluded that the Sphinx is much older than what is known. He concluded that the statue's age dates to 10,000 years BC. 3. Who carved the Sphinx? The understanding of this episode depends on the previous one. 2. The age of the pyramids. The Sphinx, a statue with a lion's body and a human head. It is the largest ancient statue in the world, carved from a single rock, 73 meters long and 20 meters high. Meaning about this 6-story building. The Sphinx was carved from the bedrock itself, as huge blocks of stones were removed from around it, and they are currently the ones that form the temples in front of it. Despite the much research work done, the Sphinx is still a mysterious statue, because we did not find any clear evidence to tell us who carved it, when, and why. Let us go back to the beginning and see how our story began. In the 80s, there was a person named John Anthony West, an independent researcher in the history of civilizations, who was reading a book called Sacred Science by the French author, Schwaller de Lubitsch. He paused at a sentence that caught his attention. The author of the book believed that the erosion on the body of this Sphinx was caused by water, not wind, as the Egyptologists believed. Well, where did this water come from if the climate of Egypt is dry? The only explanation is that the Sphinx statue was present while it was raining heavily on Egypt, at least 7,000 years BC. These erosion marks are apparent to everyone, but they needed solid scientific proof. He was unable to do this as he was not a geologist, and cannot prove it scientifically. He kept searching for a scientist to support his hypothesis, until he got to know one. Dr. Robert Schoch, a professor of geology at Boston University, and a specialist in rock analysis and erosions. John Anthony West visited him, and before he explained the matter, he did a little trick by showing him a photo of a rock, and asked, "Is the erosion of this rock caused by water or wind?" Robert Schoch confidently answered, "This is erosion caused by water." When he revealed the photo of the rock and found that it was nothing but the Sphinx, he was puzzled because he knew that the subject had a mystery. However, he was convinced to help Anthony West in his research. Both had traveled to Egypt to study the Sphinx. When they began inspecting the statue's body, they found clear marks of erosion on the body in broad lines, on its back, sides, and chest. Anyone standing in front of the statue will see the signs of erosion. As a geologist, these signs have only one explanation. What the French Schwaller said was true, and these are signs of erosion caused by water. Thus, the Sphinx was sculpted before or during the Mysterian pluvial in Egypt, older than 7,000 years BC. It was exposed to long periods of rainfall, and its body was left in water and mud for centuries, which caused the erosion of its limestone body, until it became in this form. The back of the Sphinx is eroded to the point that it becomes almost straight, unlike the backs of the statues of lions with curves. This was the first step in proving that the Sphinx witnessed the Mysterian pluvial. The second step is that Robert Schoch studied the Sphinx enclosure walls, to discover other evidence that supports his theory. It is well known that the Sphinx was carved into a rock of the pyramid's plateau itself. This made it appear as if the statue was in the middle of a trench or basin. Note that the archaeologists believed that erosion marks on the walls were caused by the winds, while the difference between the two for geologists is enormous. The limestone layers are on top of each other, hard layers above softer layers. When the wind blows for thousands of years, it removes the soft layers, and leaves the hard layers intact. Thus, the horizontal profile appears in the stones, and this is found in structures and tombs on the Giza Plateau. However, the rainy weather has an entirely different form. Round vertical grooves begin to occur in the rocks, and after hundreds or thousands of years, it becomes in this form. Well, if we look at the Sphinx enclosure wall, we will find it all eroded by rain. This was the second geological evidence of the validity of the theory that the Sphinx was present before the climate change. Shock did not stop and try to find more evidence. They did seismic studies around the Sphinx. This study aimed to know the form of the bedrock under the Sphinx. As for the idea of the sonar of the ship, whose goal is to know the depth of the sea bottom so the ship safely sail, they placed 4 sensors around the body of the Sphinx. Then someone would hit on an iron plate to generate sound waves. These sound waves penetrate the ground and return to the surface again, and they measure their speed. By measuring the speed of the sound waves returned, the shape of the rocks under the Sphinx is known. If the rocks were hard under the Sphinx, the sound would travel faster than if the rocks were decomposed. He analyzed the output data. As a result, it was discovered that the depth of the decomposed layer under the Sphinx is not trivial, and it is 3 meters at some points. An upper decomposed rocky layer and a lower solid layer. This depth would not have happened if the rain had fallen for 10 or 20 years. No. It must rain heavily for hundreds or perhaps thousands of years. This was a new and essential point of his proof, that not only the body and the enclosure walls are eroded, but also the bedrock under the Sphinx eroded from the prolonged presence of rain. And this cannot happen in a desert atmosphere. A rainy atmosphere is required. There are 2 temples in front of the Sphinx. The first is called the Sphinx Temple, and the second is called the Valley Temple. The 2 were used in their construction stones extracted during the carving of the Sphinx. The builders took stones from the Sphinx enclosure with which the 2 temples were built. As we can see, these stones are water eroded to the same extent as the Sphinx, and along the way between the 3 pyramids, you will find the erosion evidence on the large blocks exposed to the sky. This is just a sample of thousands of similar stones. We talked about 4 pieces of evidence presented by Dr. Robert Schoch: erosion on the body of the Sphinx, profile of the Sphinx enclosure walls, seismic studies under the Sphinx, and erosion of the temple's stones. And there is other evidence, but we have focused on the 4 major points. From a geological point of view, this evidence concluded that the Sphinx witnessed heavy rain. Moreover, if its true age could be between 7 to 11,000 years BC. Indeed, there is no specific number. This means that it does not belong to the dynastic period, but could be much older, and the dynasties that starts around 3000 BC had discovered and reused it. The hypothesis presented by Robert Schoch was scientific and based on geological studies. If someone wants to argue and criticize it, it doesn't help to say, you want to distort the Egyptian civilization. This won't work. As long as we speak in terms of geology, we must argue about it in the same manner. Otherwise, it is a waste of time. The Egyptian scientist, Dr. Pharaohs El-Baz, a professor at the remote sensing department at Boston University, and a colleague of Dr. Robert Schoch, Dr. Pharaohs El-Baz insists that the Sphinx was carved out around 2500 BC, as we all have learned in school. However, water erosion remains a problem, for which there is no explanation other than rain. Dr. Pharaohs argued that this erosion is a result of the water, but it could be the underground water of the Nile flood. If there is a rise in the groundwater level due to the flood, the Sphinx enclosure has been filled for years, and that is the cause of this erosion. Nevertheless, it was a good idea, but it did not hold for long. Robert Schoch quickly sorted out that if we looked at the enclosure wall, we would see this erosion gradient from top to bottom, because the rain descended from top to bottom, not the opposite. If it was underground water, the erosion would not look that way. The second point is that the stones of the temples in front of the Sphinx are high. Some reach a height of 4 to 5 meters. The floodwaters cannot reach that level. How do they erode? It is hard to find an explanation other than it comes from rain. And this point was sorted out. Well, if the statue's age is older than 7,000 years BC, then who carved the Sphinx? What is mentioned in the books is that the Sphinx was carved by King Khafre, the owner of the second pyramid. So why Khafre in particular? There are 2 reasons why archaeologists adopted this idea. First, the statue of Khafre was found in 1860 in the Valley Temple, in front of the Sphinx. The American archaeologist, George Reisner, came in the 30s. As long as we found the statue of Khafre in the Valley Temple, then he is the one who built the temple, and, inevitably, he is also the one who carved the Sphinx. Furthermore, this opinion was taken and turned to be a fact. Second, archaeologists said that the face of the Sphinx resembles the face of Khafre. Based on these 2 points, all Egyptologists considered the Sphinx as Khafre. And if you open most of the books talked about Sphinx, you will find that Sphinx equals Khafre. Well, let us see the validity of those 2 claims. It is not necessary that if the statue of Khafre was found in a temple in front of the Sphinx, that he is the one who carved the Sphinx. In Karnak temple, for example, we may find 2 chapels close to each other. One is made by a king, and the other is made by a different king. So, finding the statue of Khafre in the Valley Temple in front of the Sphinx is not enough evidence to claim that the Sphinx is carved by him. The second point is the similarity in face properties of Khafre and the Sphinx. John Anthony West was not convinced that the Sphinx resembles Khafre, but he wanted to deny this resemblance scientifically. He consulted a forensic expert, a detective named Frank Domingo, from New York PD, who has long experience in facial identifications. Frank Domingo traveled to Egypt, obtained the necessary permits to study the facial features of the Great Sphinx and the statue of Khafre in the Egyptian Museum. After an intensive study of the features of the two statues, he came up with results to clarify the differences between the Sphinx and Khafre. The eyes are wider in the Sphinx than in Khafre, and the width of the mouth is larger than Khafre's, who has a finer one. When he studied the side view of the faces, more significant differences also appeared. That the angle between the chin and the eye is more than double that of the Sphinx. Because of the protrusion of his jaw, the ancients were masters in sculpture, so they would make statues precisely like each other. Like the statues of Akhenaten, his statues are all like each other. Or the sarcophagus and mask of Tutankhamun. Even if there are differences, there are supposed to remain slight differences, but it is clear that the differences between the Sphinx and Khafre are significant, and anyone who compares their faces to pictures today will find them different. We summarize the result in a sentence for the Egyptian archaeologist, Dr. Salim Hassan. After years of research and excavations at the Sphinx, till now, we have not concluded that we can be confident of to confirm the validity of the age of the owner of the Sphinx, and we haven't found a single inscription from its time that clarifies this matter. The New Kingdom themselves were complete ignoramus of everything related to the monument, and we doubt that they knew the facts we have now about the history of the Sphinx. Dr. Salim Hassan from the book The Sphinx. In the Egyptian Museum, in the same hall as Khafre, a stone stela called the inventory stela. This stela is causing a problem because it says that Khufu made several procedures in the Giza area, including pay attention to the following sentence going over the plan to repair and decorate the Sphinx. Khufu, who was an ancestor of Khafre, repairs the Sphinx, meaning that the Sphinx was present when Khufu came to power. Consider now the Sphinx's real age, which had to be repaired and restored. The German archaeologist Dr. Bruggs said that based on this stela, King Khufu have seen the Sphinx, and therefore the Sphinx exists before him. Currently, this stela is being criticized because it was written during the 26th dynasty, that is, 2,000 years after the death of Khufu. So what? It was written by ancient Egyptians, and indeed written based on a source of information. However, ignoring this text was due to the insistence on linking the Sphinx and Khafre. Why is the head of the Sphinx not proportional to its body when viewed from the side? The Sphinx has a small head compared to its body. The other Sphinx statues found in the Egyptian Museum are consistent and beautiful. Well, do you mean that the Sphinx is not consistent? Here, Schock and West propose a revolutionary idea, that the head of the Sphinx is not his original, and that the original head eroded over time. So the kings of the dynastic period resculpted it again, and perhaps several times. That's why the head is a small size compared to the body. The Sphinx's head was the same size as the adjacent statue, and that's how the Sphinx probably looked when it was first sculpted. That's why if we get closer, we will find its head is in much better condition than the eroded body. Although, the head should be ideally in worse condition than the body, or at least its outfit, because it is the first thing that is exposed to wind and rain. The head of the Sphinx was never like that, but because of the erosion, it was recarved in the image of a particular person. However, until today, we do not know who he is. There is debate whether the statue of the Sphinx originally had the head of a lion or a human, but inevitably, this is not the original head of the Sphinx. The Sphinx is like all Egyptian monuments, it was restored in different periods. The New Kingdom made restorations on it, and then the Ptolemies and Romans made their restorations. Then we came in the last 100 years, and we made our repairs. Until today the maintenance is continuing, and the restoration stones are still apparent on it. It does not mean that the 4th dynasty made renovations to it that they are the owners, but the owners could be much older than that. Dr. Salim Hassan mentioned that the Roman historian, Pliny, believed that the Sphinx was older than the dynastic period, and that it was from the followers of Horus period. Maspero quoted, "The Great Sphinx has been the guard over the far north since the time of the followers of Horus." Some historians and scholars believe that the Sphinx was prior to the dynastic period. Is there another Sphinx? Or is it just one? A prince in ancient Egypt was on a hunting trip. Then he decided to rest a little while in the shadow of the head of the Sphinx. When he slept, the Sphinx appeared to him in a dream and announced that we would rule Egypt. He asked him to remove the sand that covered it when he became a king. This prince later became King Thutmose IV. He removed the sand covering him and built a wall to protect him from the sand encroachment in the future. He wrote this story on a granite stela in between the paws of the Sphinx. currently called the dream stela. The strange thing about this inscription is that it shows Thutmose for making offerings to two sphinx. Not only one, is this an indication of the existence of another sphinx statue. The majority of the sphinx statues are dualed. They can be found on both sides of the Rams Road. If we look at the Pompeii pillar, we will find two statues, in Luxor Temple too, right and left, and so on in many places. In 1920, Flinders Petrie, one of the first English Egyptologists, realized that there could be two sphinxes, both of which are on the same line as shown in the dream stela. So he decided to search for the second sphinx. He turned his back on the Great Sphinx, and kept looking for the other in a straight line, for any trace of the second sphinx, until he crossed the Nile continued over Muddy. Those at that time were on farms, until they reached the edge of the eastern desert, but he did not find any indication of a second sphinx. Mr. Bassem al-Shamwa is an Egyptian Egyptologist, and he also investigated this topic, and he proposed an initial location for the sphinx in this place. Based on communication with NASA, NASA sent him satellite photos of this area. They informed him that there is a stone object carved by man, or nature in this location. They didn't know for sure, but he believes that the second sphinx is theoretically located in this place. He published a book entitled The Second Sphinx, in which he documented all the evidence and photos from NASA. Unfortunately, since there are no permits to excavate, the project has been abandoned. On the other hand, Dr. Hawass replied that he had excavated this area before but did not find anything. So until now, the theory is still pending and not completely proven. Robert Bauval, whose theory we explained in the last episode, and proposed that the pyramids dated back to 10,500 BC, also investigated this matter. He believed there is another sphinx, but he did not know where exactly. One of the sphinx's names is Heremaket, which means Horus in the horizon. But where is Horus in the horizon? He went back to his astronomical computer program for the year 10,500 BC to see the shape of the sky in front of the sphinx. As soon as he went back, he saw something that shocked him, and picked up the phone to call his friend Graham Hancock. He said, "You will not believe what I have just found." Bauval knew where he could find the second sphinx. The stars of the constellation of Leo, 10,500 BC. When Robert returned to the period of the pyramids, 10,500 BC, he noticed that the constellation of Leo appeared in front of the Sphinx precisely at the same epoch. The Sphinx is known to be a symbol of the strength of a lion, and that its body is a lion's body. This means that the Great Sphinx and the pyramids belong to the same epoch, known as the Lion Epoch. In the year 10,500 BC, Orion's belt was aligned with the Giza pyramids, and the Milky Way was aligned with the Nile at the south. The Leo constellation rose in front of the Sphinx in the east. Furthermore, if we go back to 2500 BC, we will find the Leo constellation cannot be in front of the Sphinx. When the Sphinx was looking to the east, he was not looking to the sunrise. However, he was looking to his image on the horizon. For Bauval, this was new evidence of the Giza plateau, and that in the period of 10,500 BC, it was a mirror of the sky. As we said, the Nile River was identical to the Milky Way, and the 7 pyramids are equivalent to the 7 stars in the sky. Also, the Sphinx is equivalent to the stars of the lion, and this coincidence repeats every 26,000 years, which astronomers call the Great Year. In the future, there might appear things that we have not discovered, and therefore, the issue of transferring antiquities is problematic. Whether transferring temples or obelisks, because we do not know what we can discover from these monuments. The ancients choose these places for a reason, and changing the location of these monuments destroys this reason. Thus, Robert Bauval's theory became united with Robert Schoch's theory, and relating to Giza's main monuments, the pyramids, and the Sphinx date to 10,500 BC. In the early 90s, Robert Schoch explained the hypothesis of redating the Sphinx to Egyptologists about the age of the Sphinx. Dr. Mark Leonard described the team as ignorant and insensitive. Dr. Zahi Hawass stated, "This is an American hallucination." Nevertheless, Robert Schoch was stubborn, and a master of his field as a geologist. He published his theory in a book entitled The Great Sphinx, and later another book entitled Origins of the Sphinx. Explained his theory with Robert Bauval about the Sphinx and its actual age. In my opinion, Bauval and Schoch made 2 mistakes in their theories. First, they separated the pyramids and the Sphinx from the rest of the Egyptian monuments. They considered that the people who made these monuments were a different civilization from the rest, which was a weak point, as if some people made the pyramids and the Sphinx then walked away. Well, where are the temples? Where are the inscriptions? Where are the tombs? And Mark Leonard, in a debate, took advantage of this point. The second mistake is that there is much repetition of the word Atlantis, without sufficient evidence, and that the survivors of the flooded continent of Atlantis moved with their knowledge to Egypt and founded a new civilization. And this statement, until now, has had no evidence. The debate is that they say that this region is more than 10,000 years old BC. Historians say that there was no civilization here in 10,000 years BC. So, they responded, well, then this is a lost civilization. Until we know who they are, we will call it the lost civilization. Egypt passed in its beginning an era called the era of the gods. And Horus, the son of Isis and Osiris, is the last of those gods. And he gave up his role in favor of a group of powerful kings, and he took charge of protecting them to begin the period of the followers of Horus or Shamsuhur. Moreover, I believe that the kings of Shamsuhur are the kings of the golden age of Egyptian civilization, because their existence coincides with that of the builders of the pyramids and the Sphinx. Most of the miracles that we see were built by them, not by the dynastic kings, although there are no specific years decided for them, as these numbers are lost from the Turin papyrus. The current numbers are primarily conclusions. However, we knew that they existed before the dynastic period and ruled for at least 5,000 years, according to what Eusebius of Caesarea quoted from Manetho. After Babel's theory about the age of the pyramids came out, and Schock and Anthony West's theory about the age of the Sphinx in the early 90s, we can say that there were two major opinions about Egyptian civilization, which resulted in the existence of two opposing streams. The first stream is the official stream, and this is the largest and most famous stream. The prestigious people, the heads of the history and archaeology departments in universities, the curators of museums, and those who speak on behalf of antiquities in official forums. Furthermore, the most famous names, including Dr. Zahi Hawass, Dr. Mark Lenner, Dr. Rainer Stadelman, Dr. Bob Breyer, Dr. Shlomo Ikram, and many others. This stream follows the official version that has been written in the references for decades. In summary, the Egyptian civilization began around 3500 BC, and the kings of the dynastic period were the only owners of the pyramids, obelisks, and temples. They used primitive tools in construction and sculpture, such as hammers, chisels, sleds, and wooden lifts, and that the Egyptian civilization gradually collapsed over hundreds of years because of the weakness of the government and the entry of foreigners, then the invasion of the country by the Persians, Greeks, and Romans, to the extent that it reached complete collapse and disappearance. The second stream presents an entirely different story from the official stream, and you may find them in books under the name Modern Stream. His most famous names are Graham Hancock, John Anthony West, Christopher Dunn, Robert Schock, Robert Bubble, and many others, including many Egyptians. They present astronomical, geological, and scientific evidence that proves a vital missing piece of Egyptian history, dating back 12,000 years BC. Moreover, the Egyptian civilization peaked its superiority in this period. The owners of this era were the builders of the pyramids, obelisks, temples, and giant statues, and they possessed advanced technologies and sciences that were not primitive, and we have not yet understood it. Moreover, the Egyptian civilization has not gradually collapsed. Instead, collapsed due to a powerful catastrophe. The dynastic period came after them, and they rediscovered and used the statues, sarcophagi, temples, and obelisks that the ancient ancestors had made. This catastrophe has much evidence, but the most important of them are three. Firstly, the presence of many destroyed temples and destroyed pyramids, and broken statues in most archaeological sites, to the extent that tourists always ask why everything is broken like this. It is clear that the end was not expected. The issue is more than the entry of the Hyksos or Persians. The second evidence is that there are many halted engineering works, incomplete pyramids, incomplete sarcophagi, or not located in their proper places, as the owners intended to complete them and did not have the time to finish. The third piece of evidence is the loss of knowledge. We were building pyramids and making obelisks, and suddenly we did not know how these structures were being built, nor what their real benefit was. And all of this, we will see details in the upcoming episodes. Of course, the second stream is attacked, and gets accusations of destroying the official story. But their arguments contain a great deal of reason and logic. Since we were young, we learned, heard, and read the theories of the mainstream. The time has come for us to consider the second stream, what they say and how they think. See you next time. After so many years spent in research and investigation on the origins of the Egyptian civilization and its true story, particularly the research on the Sphinx, John Anthony West left our world in 2018.